Most people work 40 years. Some exit in 10. Same economy. Same income range. So what creates the gap? Here's the problem. Most people never run the math. They assume the answer is no before they test it. But once you calculate it, everything changes. The question is no longer, is this possible? It becomes, what does this demand? And more importantly, what does this cost? Ethan is 28 years old. He earns $90,000 a year. He has $8,000 saved. Nothing extreme, nothing unusual. But he makes one decision most people avoid. He is not chasing a better job. He is not chasing a raise. He wants an exit, a full exit, 10 years. By 38, he wants financial freedom. This is not what people imagine. Before we follow what he does, we need to define what he is actually chasing. Because financial freedom sounds clear until you try to calculate it. In reality, there are 3 versions, and each one leads to a different life. The first is full financial independence. This is the dream version. Your investments cover everything. Housing, food, healthcare, travel. You never need to earn again. The second is lean financial independence. Same structure, smaller life. Your investments cover the basics. Anything extra requires optional work. The third is coast financial independence. And this is where everything shifts because you invest enough early so your money grows on its own and fund your future, which means you still work, but not for survival. And this is where everything shifts. All 3 versions come from one rule, the 4% rule. If you withdraw 4% of your portfolio each year, your money should last decades. Reverse that logic. It gives you your number. Multiply your yearly expenses by 25. Ethan runs his numbers. He simplifies his life. He cuts aggressively. He can live on $32,000 a year. Multiply that by 25. His number becomes $800,000. Pause for a second. He has $8,000. He needs $800,000. That's not growth. That's a gap. Most people focus on income. That's the wrong variable. The most important number is savings rate, the percentage of what you earn that you actually keep. At 15%, financial independence takes about 40 years. At 30%, it drops to around 28. At 50%, it's about 17. At 65%, it's close to 12. To approach 10 years, Ethan needs around 70%. That's the reality. Ethan earns $90,000. After taxes, he keeps about $68,000. To stay on track, he needs to invest roughly $47,000 per year. That leaves about $21,000 to live on, around $1,750 a month. In most cities, that does not work, so he makes the first real move and leaves his current city, moving to a low-cost area where rent is around $650, while he sells his car and replaces it with something cheaper, removes subscriptions, stops eating out, and simplifies everything down to what is necessary. This is not glamorous. This is the part nobody tells you. Freedom at the start feels like restriction, and his life gets smaller, more controlled, and more repetitive because he declines trips, skips events, sees fewer people, and builds routines around consistency. On paper, it works. In real life, it's heavy. This is where most people slow down. By the end of year 1, he invests about $45,000, and with moderate returns, his portfolio reaches roughly $52,000, which looks like progress at first glance. But here's the problem. It's not enough. 10 years of $45,000 contributions equals $450,000. Add growth, and he might reach around $600,000. Still not $800,000. That's the gap. This is where it breaks. You cannot cut your way to freedom on this timeline. And this is where the plan starts to feel real. Because cutting expenses got him here, but income is what moves him forward. There are 3 levers. Income, expenses, returns. Year 1 was expenses. Year 2 becomes income because that is where acceleration happens. Ethan negotiates. He prepares data. He makes the ask. He gets a 10% increase. Then he builds skills and studies what higher-paying roles require, so his evenings disappear into learning. Then he switches roles, and his income jumps to $115,000. Then he builds a side income, starting small with a few hours per week and gradually increasing it until it becomes consistent. And this is where pressure builds, because now he is not just cutting expenses, he is pushing time to its limit. And the plan starts demanding more than discipline, because it requires consistency under pressure. By the end of year 2, his total income reaches around $145,000, while his expenses remain near $22,000, which pushes his savings rate above 80%. And this is where the math starts to bend, because his portfolio climbs to approximately $130,000. And for the first time, the goal no longer looks impossible. It looks conditional. But this is also where an uncomfortable truth appears. Most people will not do this. Not because they can't, because they don't want this life. Fast timelines require extreme decisions. By the start of year 3, Ethan has around $130,000 invested. And this is where the most important calculation appears. Because if he stops contributing entirely and allows that money to grow at an average rate of 8% over the next 30 years, it becomes over $1 million without adding another dollar. And now the plan looks different. He could stop here. He could return to a normal life, spend more, travel, relax, and still end up financially free later. So the question changes. Not whether he can do it, but whether he should continue. You can't judge this without a comparison. And this is where Lucas enters the picture. Lucas is the same age as Ethan. He started from a similar position. He earns in the same range. But he chooses a different path, because he never tries to escape in 10 years and never pushes extreme savings rates. And instead, he saves around 15% of his income consistently, invests in broad index funds, and builds his life alongside his finances instead of compressing everything into a short timeline. By the time Ethan reaches year 3 with about $130,000 invested, Lucas has around $45,000, which looks like a massive gap at first glance. And if you freeze the moment, it seems obvious who is ahead. But this is where people make a critical mistake, because they compare snapshots instead of trajectories. Lucas keeps it simple because he saves 15% every year, his income grows slowly, and his contributions grow with it, while he changes jobs occasionally, improves his earnings over time, maintains relationships, travels, and does not optimize every decision around money. Over 35 to 40 years, this approach leads him to roughly $1.20 to $1.50 million, depending on market conditions. Now compare that again. If Ethan stops at $130,000 and simply lets it compound, he ends up in a similar range. He's not ahead by money. He is ahead by time, because he compresses decades into a shorter window and reaches financial independence 15 to 20 years earlier. That is the real difference. This is where the plan starts to feel real. Ethan continues into year 4 with roughly $200,000 invested, and up to this point, everything looks controlled. But this is where the plan becomes fragile, because market behavior starts to matter more than discipline. This is where control disappears. The long-term average return sits around 8 to 10%, but individual years rarely follow that pattern, which means outcomes can vary significantly in the short term. In a strong market scenario, with returns around 12%, Ethan's portfolio could grow quickly and reach around $330,000 by the end of the year after contributions. While in a moderate scenario with returns closer to 8%, he lands around $300,000, which keeps him on track but leaves little room for error. But in a negative year, where markets decline by 15%, his $200,000 drops to around $170,000 before contributions. And even after adding another $90,000, he finishes the year near $260,000, which effectively erases more than a year of progress. This is where the plan becomes fragile, because timing now matters as much as discipline. And this is what makes aggressive timelines unstable, since they depend on both behavior and external conditions aligning. Now consider another scenario where Ethan never increases his income beyond roughly $100,000, because in that case his yearly contributions remain lower. And over 10 years, even with growth, he likely ends up closer to $600,000, which stretches the timeline beyond the original goal. Now consider one more scenario where the market delivers little to no real return in the early years, because in that case, Ethan continues investing, but his portfolio barely moves, which pushes the entire timeline further out. Even if he does everything right, he might still miss the 10-year target, not because he failed, but because the system does not move in straight lines. Assuming average conditions, Ethan continues forward, and year 5 brings him to around $380,000, year 6 to roughly $460,000, and year 7 to approximately $540,000. And at this stage, something begins to shift because growth from his investments starts to rival his contributions. By year 8, his portfolio approaches $620,000. By year 9, it moves toward $700,000. By year 10, depending on returns, he lands somewhere between $780,000 and $850,000. Now he is at the threshold. But this is not a clean moment. It is a range. This is not what people imagine. Ethan compresses time. Lucas keeps balance. Both paths work, but they create very different lives. Most people don't fail the math. They avoid it. Because once you understand it, you can't pretend anymore. The timeline was never the point. The trade-off was. Speed costs something. Balance costs something. You don't get both. So the real question is not, can you do it? It's, what are you willing to give up?